The horse was already gone when she came out to stop him. Nate Yarrow stood in the iron-gray morning with his hands at his sides, and snow coming down in curtains so thick she could barely see the barn behind him, and she understood in the space between one heartbeat and the next what he had done. The sorrel mare was gone. The stall door hung open. The rope she had tied across the fence post was trailing in the mud and snow like something that had given up entirely on its purpose. "You gave her away," Lena Ortega said, and her voice came out small against the howling white world. Nate did not turn around immediately. He stood with his broad back to her, his coat dark with snow, his hat pulled low, and she could see the tension in his shoulders, that coiled, stubborn refusal to justify himself that she had come to recognize in the 4 days she had known him. When he finally turned, his jaw was set and his eyes were that particular shade of gray-green that she had started cataloging without meaning to, the way you catalog things you are afraid of losing. "She will make it to the Colby farm," he said. "Old Hank Colby has a good barn and more feed than he knows what to do with. Your boy will be warm by nightfall. Tobias has a fever of 103, she said, the words cracking. "And you just gave away your only horse. In a blizzard. Nate, that is your only way out of here. That is your only way anywhere." Something moved across his face, some dark interior thing that he did not let fully surface. "I know what it was." "Then why?" "Because it needed doing." He said it with a flatness that was not cruelty. It was the flatness of a man who had made calculations she was not privy to. And the result had come out in her children's favor, and he was not going to apologize for the arithmetic. Lena Ortega pressed her hand over her mouth and felt the cold seep into her fingers and thought about all the things she should say, and could not say any of them. She had been a widow for 14 months. She had learned in those 14 months how to be hard, how to make decisions without flinching, how to look her 2 children in the eye and tell them everything was going to be fine, and almost believe it herself. She had not learned how to receive grace from a stranger without it undoing something fundamental in her chest. The snow came down. Nate Yarrow looked at her with those careful eyes. And somewhere inside the small farmhouse behind her, her 6-year-old son Tobias coughed in a way that sounded like breaking. She had found Nate Yarrow 4 days ago on the road that ran past her property, which was not really a road anymore in November, just a frozen suggestion of one. She had been coming back from the feed store in Durance, the town that sat 8 miles east of her 40-acre parcel in the hill country of southwestern Colorado, with a wagon load of flour and salt, and the last of her money spent in a way that felt like gambling, because the winter was already threatening to be brutal. And she had 2 children and 3 chickens and a cow that had stopped giving milk and a farmhouse that let in the wind through gaps she had been meaning to fix since August. She had found him on the side of the road with his horse standing patient, and still beside him and him crouched down in the frozen mud studying something she could not immediately identify. When she pulled the wagon to a stop and he stood, she saw that he was tall, rangy in the way of men who covered long distances on horseback, with a face that had been weathered by exposure to every kind of sky. He had a week's worth of dark stubble and eyes that assessed her with a directness that was neither aggressive nor unkind. "Trouble," she had said, because she was a practical woman and that was a practical question. "Rattlesnake den," he had said, which was not the answer she expected. 3 of them on the road, frozen through. Your horse would have stepped on them in another 20 yards and spooked. He nudged one of the limp, rigid shapes with his boot, moving it to the ditch. "Should be fine now." Lena had looked at him for a moment. "You moved rattlesnakes for a stranger." "They were frozen," he said, as if this made it less remarkable, which it did not. "I'm Lena Ortega." "Nate Yarrow." She had looked at him a beat longer and then done something she had not done in a long time. She had made a decision based on instinct rather than evidence. My farmhouse is about 3 miles up. If you are heading somewhere that is not urgent, I could use help with a few repairs before the snow comes in hard. He had looked at the sky with the expression of a man who had been reading weather for a long time. Snow is coming in tonight, he had said. I can help with repairs. He had not asked what she was paying. He had not asked about her husband. He had simply tied his sorrel mare to the back of her wagon and climbed up onto the seat beside her with his saddlebags over one shoulder. And that was how Nate Yarrow had come into her life, on a frozen November road in Colorado in 1882. The year after the railroad had changed everything in that part of the territory, and the year before it would change everything again. Lena Ortega had come to Colorado from New Mexico Territory 4 years earlier with her husband Miguel, who had believed, the way men of that era believed, that land was freedom and freedom was worth the suffering it cost to hold it. Miguel had been right about land being freedom and wrong about what it cost, because it had cost him his life. A riding accident in September of 1881 that had left Lena with 40 acres, 2 children, 9-year-old Clara and 4-year-old Tobias at the time, a failing farm, and a grief so heavy she sometimes sat down on the kitchen floor in the middle of the afternoon and could not get up for an hour. She had gotten up every time. That was the only thing she could say with certainty about herself. By the time Nate Yarrow knocked on the door of her life, she had made the farm solvent if not flourishing. She had fixed most of the fences. She had negotiated a fair price for her wool with the merchant Endurance, a process that had required 3 separate arguments because the merchant, a man named Terrence Flood, had assumed that a widow would accept whatever he offered. She had raised Clara and Tobias with a steadiness that cost her privately, but showed outwardly as confidence. She had not let herself be lonely in any way she could not manage. She was, in short, a woman who had sealed herself against the particular vulnerability of needing someone. And then Nate Yarrow had arrived with his quiet competence, and his unexplained history, and his way of doing things without being asked, and 4 days had been enough for her defenses to develop cracks. He had fixed the gaps in the farmhouse walls the first afternoon, moving with an efficiency that suggested he had built and repaired things his whole life. He had replaced 2 fence posts that had rotted through. He had split enough firewood in a single morning to keep them warm for 2 weeks, working in a steady rhythm that was almost meditative to watch. And Lena had watched from the kitchen window more than was strictly necessary. Clara, who was now 10 and had opinions about everything, had given him her formal assessment on the second morning. He is quiet, she had told her mother while Lena braided her hair. But not the kind of quiet that means something is wrong, the kind that means he is thinking. When did you become a philosopher? Lena had said. I have always been a philosopher, Clara said with complete seriousness, and Lena had laughed for the first time in longer than she could remember. Tobias had taken longer to warm up, because Tobias was cautious in ways that Clara was not, had been cautious since his father died, as if the world had revealed itself as a place where good things could simply end without warning. But on the second evening Nate had sat down on the porch steps with a piece of wood and a small knife and had begun carving without addressing anyone in particular. And Tobias had edged closer by degrees over the course of 20 minutes, the way animals approach something they are not sure about. And by the end, he had been sitting close enough to Nate's shoulder that their arms nearly touched, watching the wood take the shape of a horse. Nate had finished the horse and handed it to Tobias without ceremony. Tobias had held it with both hands and said, "That looks like your horse." "It does a little," Nate had said. "Her name is Callie. Is she nice?" "She is the best horse I have ever known," Nate had said, with a simplicity that was clearly the truth. And Tobias had looked at the carved wooden horse, and then at the man who had carved it, and something had shifted in the boy's careful face. The next morning, Tobias had woken with the fever. Lena had known it was bad by early afternoon. She had grown up with a mother who knew medicine the way some people know music, intuitively, practically, without needing to name the theory behind it. She knew the difference between a fever that burned itself out in a day and a fever that went deeper. Tobias had the second kind. His skin was dry and hot, and his eyes had a glassy, inward look, and he kept asking for water in a voice that seemed to come from far away. The nearest doctor was in Durance, 8 miles in weather that was deteriorating by the hour. Lena had made the decision in the kitchen with her hands flat on the table and her teeth clenched, running through every option the way she always did when she was frightened, systematically, without panic, even though panic was pressing at the edges of everything. Her own horse was a reliable workhorse, older, not built for speed but steady. She could make it to Durance and back with the doctor before the storm hit its peak, maybe. But Clara was 10 and capable of watching her brother for several hours, but could not manage a medical crisis alone. Lena could not take Clara with her and leave Tobias alone. Lena could not leave both children here without an adult. Nate had been at the barn when she came out. He had read her face in the way he had of reading things, comprehensively, quickly. She had told him what was happening, and he had not said anything for a moment, and then he had said, "I will ride to Durance for the doctor. Callie is faster than your horse, and she knows hard weather." Lena had wanted to say no, because saying yes meant accepting something significant from a man she had known for days. And the part of her that had been managing alone for 14 months had a reflexive resistance to that. But Tobias was asking for water again in that far-away voice, and the sky was the specific gray that meant serious snow, and she had said yes. Nate had ridden out at 3 in the afternoon. The snow had begun at 4. By 6, it was a full storm, wind-driven and hard. The kind that came off the mountains with a particular fury and buried roads and landmarks with equal indifference. Lena sat beside Tobias's bed and held his hand and talked to him in a low, steady voice, and listened to the wind attack the farmhouse, and thought about Nate Yarrow out in it, and tried not to think about Nate Yarrow out in it. He came back at 9 that night with the doctor, a compact, efficient man named Dr. Howell, who examined Tobias with the focused attention of someone who had been doing this work for 30 years, and had no patience for anything that was not relevant to the task at hand. He diagnosed pneumonia, gave Lena a course of treatment that involved specific medicines he had in his bag and specific instructions for managing the fever and specific conditions under which she should send for him again. And he delivered all of this with the calm certainty of a man whose calm was its own kind of medicine. Lena paid him. He shook hands with Nate in the way men did when they had ridden hard in bad weather together and shared something unspoken. Then he went back out into the storm to make the return trip to Durance, having arranged with his neighbor to watch for his arrival. Lena stood in the kitchen after the doctor left and looked at Nate Yarrow, who was standing near the stove with his coat still on, wet through, his hat dripping onto the floorboards. There was a cut on his jaw from where a piece of ice or a branch had caught him. He looked like someone who had been through something and was not going to comment on it. "You could have been killed out there," she said. "The storm was bad but not impossible," he said, with that same flatness that was not dismissal but was something else, something she was beginning to understand as the way he absorbed things that had cost him without performing the cost. "Sit down," she said. "I am going to make coffee and you are going to sit down," He sat. She made coffee. The farmhouse held against the storm with a solidity that the patched walls and replaced fence posts had something to do with, and Lena stood at the stove and felt the quiet between them as something with texture and weight. Not uncomfortable, but not nothing either. She brought him coffee and she sat across from him, and they did not talk about anything urgent for a while. He told her he had grown up in Kansas, in a small town that had been a cattle drive stop before the railroad changed the routes, and then had become slowly less of anything. His father had been a blacksmith. His mother had been a woman who read everything she could find and had given Nate a restlessness that her own contained life could not satisfy. He had left at 20 and had been in motion more or less since. He was 31. She was 28. He did not tell her what he was moving toward, and she did not ask, because she understood, in the way she understood things about people, that the answer was complicated and possibly that he did not know, and that asking would close something that was currently open. She told him about Miguel. Not much. Enough. The way you tell a person about a wound when you want them to understand the shape of your life, not to ask for sympathy. She told him about building the farm, about the arguments with Terrence Flood at the feed store, about Clara's opinions and Tobias's caution. She told him about the morning she had sat on the kitchen floor for an hour and could not get up, and he had listened to that with an attention that was neither pity nor alarm, just the full, honest weight of his attention. "How did you get up?" he asked. "Clara came in and stood next to me," she said. "She did not say anything, she just stood there, and after a while I got up." He was quiet for a moment. "She is a remarkable person." "She is," Lena said. "I do not take credit for it, she came that way." He looked at her across the table with those gray-green eyes and said, "You should take some credit." She looked down at her coffee. The storm howled. Tobias coughed from the other room. The moment stretched and contracted and stretched again. That was the third night. On the fourth morning she had woken to find him already at work. The fire built up, coffee made, and had come outside to find the barn door hanging open and Callie gone. She had stood in the snow and understood what he had done and why, understood the full architecture of his sacrifice in an instant, because that was the kind of woman she was. He had found another solution to the problem of getting Tobias warm medicine at intervals he could not guarantee she could deliver alone. A solution that involved the Colby farm 3 miles north, whose proximity to a good road and whose supply of resources could help in ways her own farm, currently snowbound, could not. He had arranged it before dawn. He had taken Callie 3 miles through blizzard conditions to the Colby farm and left her in Hank Colby's care with instructions, and he had walked back. He had walked back through the blizzard. 3 miles, in the dark. And now, he was standing in front of her in the snow with snow on his shoulders, and that look on his face that said he had done the arithmetic, and was not sorry about the result. "Callie is your only horse," she said again, because she needed him to understand that she understood exactly what that meant. In 1882, in Colorado, a man without a horse was not a man who was going anywhere. He was a man who was staying where he was until circumstance changed, and circumstance in a blizzard was not a reliable engine. "She is," he agreed. "You have given up your ability to leave. For now." She looked at him. "You walked back 3 miles in a blizzard after leaving her." The path was manageable. "Nate." He looked at her with something naked in his face just for a second, something that was not the flatness or the competence or the contained way he carried himself, something real and unguarded and slightly afraid. And then he looked away and said, "Your boy needed more than what I could arrange from here. This was the better option." Lena Ortega had been managing alone for 14 months. She had learned to be hard, and she had learned to receive nothing from anyone without a transaction attached to it. Because the world in 1882 in rural Colorado was not built around generosity without motive, and she had learned that the hard way. And here was this man who had arrived 4 days ago and moved rattlesnakes from her path and fixed her walls and ridden through a blizzard for her son, and now given up his only horse, his only mobility, his only exit, because her son had a fever. She crossed the space between them in 3 steps and took his face in both hands, his cold-bitten, stubbled, snow-dusted face, and she looked at him for a long second, and then she kissed him. It was not a gentle kiss. It was not tentative. It was the kind of kiss that happens when something breaks, when a wall that has been holding against pressure for too long finally gives way at a point you did not expect. He stood still for a single shocked second, and then his hands came up to her waist, and he kissed her back with a thoroughness that suggested he had been thinking about this for at least 3 days, which, she would discover later, he had. When they pulled apart, the snow was still coming down, and Tobias was coughing inside, and Clara would be awake soon, and nothing about the circumstances had changed. But something had changed. They both knew it. The air between them had a different quality, charged and warm even in the cold, and Nate Yarrow looked at her with those gray-green eyes fully open now, all the flatness gone, just him, real and present and slightly overwhelmed. "Well," he said. His voice was rough. "Well," she agreed. Then she took his hand and pulled him inside out of the snow, because there was a sick child who needed tending and coffee that needed reheating, and the farmhouse was warm and they were both still standing. And that, Lena Ortega had learned, was where everything began. The storm lasted 3 days. 3 days of snow so dense, and wind so sharp, that going more than 20 feet from the farmhouse was an act of genuine recklessness. Lena had experienced Colorado blizzards before and knew the protocol, which was essentially to stay inside, keep the fire burning, keep the animals as settled as possible with the hay you had laid in, and wait with whatever patience you could manufacture. She had patience. She had developed it the way you develop muscles, through repeated necessity. What she had not had before was Nate Yarrow inside the farmhouse with her. The dynamic of those 3 days was something she would think about for the rest of her life. They were snowbound, all 4 of them, in a space of 3 rooms and a loft, and the intimacy of that enforced proximity did things to her careful management of her own feelings that she could not entirely control. She had kissed him in the snow, and the knowledge of that sat between them all day like a lamp that had been lit, warm and visible to both of them, neither of them acknowledging it directly while Clara was present, because there was a rightness to that discretion that they both felt without discussing it. But there were moments, small, precise moments that were more devastating than the kiss in some ways because they were quiet. The first morning of the storm, she had been sitting beside Tobias's bed reading to him when Nate came in with a cup of water and set it on the bedside table and stayed to listen. She had been reading from a book of adventure stories that Clara had found somewhere, and she was doing the voices, which she only did when she thought no one over the age of 10 was listening. And she had looked up and found him leaning against the doorframe with something in his face that she could not immediately name. It was not amusement exactly. It was closer to wonder. Like she was something he had not expected to encounter, she had kept reading. Her voice had gotten slightly unsteady. The second morning of the storm, Tobias's fever had broken. She had been awake all night monitoring it, the kind of vigil that required a stillness of spirit she found difficult. And when the fever finally broke at 4 in the morning and Tobias sighed in his sleep, and his skin went from dry and burning to normally warm, she had sat back in the chair beside his bed and pressed her hands over her face and cried, quietly and completely, the way she only cried when no one could see her. except that Nate was sleeping on the floor of the hallway outside, because he had insisted on being close in case she needed anything, and she had not argued because the truth was she had wanted someone nearby, and he heard her. And he came in and sat on the floor beside her chair and put his hand over hers without saying anything. They stayed like that until the sky began to lighten, his hand over hers, the sleeping child between them, the storm outside. She did not cry anymore. She did not need to. Clara noticed everything and said nothing about it until the second day, when she cornered Lena in the kitchen while Nate was at the barn checking on the cow. "He is staying," Clara said. It was not a question. "He does not have a horse," Lena said, which was factual if not entirely responsive. Clara gave her the look she had been giving her since she was approximately 5 years old, the look that said she was aware that her mother was being evasive. "That is not what I meant." Lena kept stirring the stew. "I know what you meant. Tobias likes him," Clara said. "I like him." "I think you like him." "I am aware of what I like," Lena said. "Are you?" Clara said, with the preternatural certainty of a 10-year-old who has decided something is true. Lena put down the spoon. She looked at her daughter, this small, fierce person who had stood beside her on a kitchen floor and saved her without knowing she was doing it. "What do you think?" she asked. Not deflecting. Genuinely asking. Clara was quiet for a moment, which was unusual for her. Then she said, "I think Papa would have liked him. Papa liked people who did things without making a big show of it." Lena did not trust her voice for a moment. Then she said, "Yes, he would have." Clara picked up the spoon and tasted the stew with the authority of someone who had opinions about seasoning. "Needs more salt," she said, and handed the spoon back, and the conversation was over. But something had been settled, between them and inside Lena, that she had not known needed settling. On the third night of the storm, with Tobias sleeping peacefully and Clara asleep in the loft, Lena and Nate sat at the kitchen table after supper, and the lamp between them made shadows on the walls, and the wind outside was finally diminishing to a low, steady complaint rather than a full assault. And they talked, really talked, the kind of talking that happens when two people have been circling each other for days, and the circling has resolved itself into something that requires honesty. He told her about his dark past, which was not dramatic in the sense of crimes, but was dark in the sense of losses accumulated and places burned. He had been engaged once in Kansas, a woman named Rose Albright, whose family had run a dry goods store and who had been kind and practical and good. She had died of typhoid fever in 1876, 2 months before they were supposed to be married, and he had left Kansas the following spring because everything in the town was a reminder of something unfinished. He had been moving since then. "Moving away from it?" Lena asked. "At first," he said. "Then I stopped moving away from it and started just moving. There is a kind of freedom in it that becomes its own trap after a while." He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "You stop being free and you start being unable to stop. What would stopping look like?" She asked, and she asked it quietly, not with an agenda, just with the genuine question. He looked at her across the table with an expression that was so unguarded she felt it like something physical. "I am starting to have an idea about that," he said. She held his gaze. Outside, the wind dropped another notch. The lamp made its light between them. "There are things you do not know about me," she said, because fairness required it. "I can be difficult. I am used to doing things my own way. I have 2 children whose needs come first and always will. I have debts that are manageable but real and a farm that will require hard work. I am not an easy situation to walk into." "I know," he said. "You have known me 5 days. 7, counting the storm days." A slight thing happened at the corner of his mouth. "I am a good counter." "That is not an argument." "No," he agreed. "It is not." He was quiet for a moment. I know that I am not entitled to anything here. I know that what has happened between us in the last week is something that needs time and care and that you have every reason to be careful. I am not asking you for anything. That is a very careful answer, she said. I am a careful person, he said. When it counts. She thought about what Clara had said. She thought about Miguel, who had believed in things worth being reckless for. She thought about the kitchen floor and the hour of sitting on it and the standing up. She thought about this man who had moved rattlesnakes and ridden through blizzards and given up his only horse and walked back 3 miles in the dark. You could stay, she said, through the winter. Help with the farm, we would see how things are. She paused. Not as a hired hand, not as an obligation, just you could stay. He looked at her for a long time. Yes, he said, simply and completely. The words settled into the room like something that had always been meant to be there. The morning after the storm, Hank Colby came by with a horse-drawn sleigh, because Hank Colby was that kind of neighbor, the kind who had been watching out for Lena Ortega since Miguel died with a gruff unobtrusiveness that was the most reliable form of kindness she knew. He was 60, wide-shouldered, with a white beard and hands that had been working Colorado land for 30 years, and he arrived at her door with a crate of provisions that she had not asked for, and a knowing look that she chose to receive without comment. He had Callie on a lead line. Lena felt Nate go still beside her on the porch. Good mare, Hank said, handing the lead line to Nate with the directness of a man who said what he meant. She did what you needed her to do. Took your message to my boy, and he rode to the Ridge station and back before the worst of the storm, so the medication will be here by tomorrow. Your boy doing better, much better, Lena said. Thank you, Hank. Hank looked at Nate with the evaluation of a man who had seen a lot of people make a lot of choices. That was a good thing you did, he said. Came back through some hard conditions. The mare needed to be out of it, Nate said. Seems to me the mare was not the only one who needed shelter, Hank said, with a deliberateness that made Lena press her lips together to control her expression. Hank was not subtle. He had never been subtle. It was one of the things she appreciated about him. He said good morning, told Nate that if he needed work while he was in the area, he knew 3 ranchers who were hiring, and departed with the efficiency of a man who had other farms to check on. Nate stood on the porch holding Callie's lead line. The mare nuzzled his shoulder with the affection of an animal for a person she trusted. He raised his hand and touched her nose with a gentleness that made Lena's chest do something complicated. She is back, Lena said. She is, he said. His voice was quiet and he did not look at her, just at Callie. I was going to find a way to get back to her. I know you were, Lena said. She paused. She is a beautiful horse. She has carried me a long way, he said. Good company on a long road. Lena came down the porch steps and stood beside him in the snow that had been trampled to a hard white crust by Hank's sleigh runners. She reached out and touched Callie's flank. The mare turned her head and looked at her with the large, dark patience of horses. I think she approves of you, Nate said, watching. Animals are better judges than people, Lena said. Usually, he agreed. They were standing very close. The winter morning was brilliant with the particular brightness that comes after heavy snow, everything white and sharp and clean. He turned and looked at her, and she looked back, and there was a moment of pure suspended recognition. The kind that comes when 2 people understand simultaneously that they are standing at a threshold and can see clearly in both directions. He leaned down and kissed her carefully in the full daylight where anyone could see, where Clara might see, where she herself could see what she was doing and choose it, which was the most important part. She chose it. The winter did not ease. December in southwestern Colorado in 1882 was a sequence of hard conditions, cold that settled into the bones and stayed, more snow, winds that came without warning and left ice where they went. It was the kind of winter that separated the people who belonged to a place from the people who were just visiting. And Lena Ortega had been belonging to this place for 4 years, and she knew how to manage it. What she had not managed before was managing it with someone alongside her. Nate had stayed. He had moved into the barn initially, insisting on the barn because propriety was a real force in 1882, and he was not going to expose her to the kind of talk that would make her life harder, and she had appreciated the thought and made arrangements for him to sleep in the small back room that had been a storage room and could be made comfortable. It was still closed to the kitchen, still inside the farmhouse's warmth, and still far enough in distance and position to represent a clear and honest arrangement. Clara thought the whole thing was very logical and said so. Tobias recovered from his pneumonia in stages, first the fever, and then the cough, and then the restored appetite that was the most reassuring sign of all. On the first day he was strong enough to come to the kitchen table for breakfast. He sat across from Nate and ate an entire bowl of porridge with a focused seriousness and then looked up and said, "Thank you for getting the doctor." Nate looked at him steadily. "You are welcome, and for my horse." Tobias had the carved wooden horse with him at all times. He brought it to meals. "I named her Callie, like the real one." Something moved through Nate's face, warm and complicated. "That is a good name," he said. The days developed a rhythm that was particular and good. Nate took on the heavier physical work of the farm with the ease of a man who knew how to do physical work and liked it. The fence repairs that the storm had undone, the maintenance of the barn, the twice daily splitting of firewood that winter required. He was not performing usefulness, not trying to justify his presence. He was simply doing what needed doing with a matter-of-fact engagement that gradually, over weeks, began to feel like the farm was breathing properly for the first time since Miguel died. Lena noticed this with a complexity of feeling. There was relief, genuine and profound, because she had been carrying the full weight of this place alone for too long, and relief is relief. It does not require apology. There was also something that was harder to sit with, the recognition that she had missed this, not a man specifically but this, the presence of another person who cared about the same things she cared about, who noticed the same problems and thought about the same solutions, and came to the dinner table with the specific tiredness of someone who had done real work. She had missed it in a way she had not let herself fully acknowledge, because acknowledging it had seemed like a betrayal of her own adequacy. She was adequate. She had proven that. She did not need someone else to make the farm run. But there was a difference between adequate and this was better. She told him this one evening while they were doing the bookkeeping, which was her job and which she had not offered to share but which he had looked over her shoulder at one night, and then, very carefully, pointed out a calculation error that had been costing her money for 4 months. She had stared at the numbers for a moment and then she had laughed, and he had looked slightly alarmed by the laughter. "I have been losing 17 cents a week since August," she said. "It compounds," he said, still watching her carefully. "I know it compounds. That is why I am laughing." She shook her head and recalculated. "Where did you learn bookkeeping?" "My father kept books for the livery as well as the smithy," he said. "He was very precise about money, said imprecision about money was how good people lost the things they worked for." "He was right," she said. She looked at the corrected numbers for a moment. "I am going to say something and I need you to receive it without making it smaller than it is." He waited. "I am glad you are here," she said. "Not because of the fence posts or the firewood or the bookkeeping. Because I had forgotten what it felt like to not be doing everything alone, and I had convinced myself that the forgetting was the same as not needing it. And you are showing me that it is not the same thing." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I spent 6 years on the road telling myself that the moving was freedom. But I think I was actually just avoiding the feeling that staying in one place meant being somewhere without Rose. And I think I needed to be moving long enough to understand the difference between grief and habit." He paused. "This is not habit. Being here is not habit." She looked at him. "What is it?" "It is where I want to be," he said. She reached across the table and took his hand, and he turned his palm up to hold hers, and they stayed like that while the fire settled, and the winter pressed against the windows, and the children slept upstairs, and the farm held them all within its walls like something that had been waiting for this specific configuration to be complete. In January, the situation with Terrence Flood came to a head. Lena had known it was coming. Flood had been pressing on the issue of her wool contract since November, trying to renegotiate terms that were already unfavorable to her, using the winter as leverage. His argument was that he was taking on risk by agreeing to buy her wool before the spring market, that the price of risk should be reflected in what he paid her. His argument was also, though he would not say this aloud, that she was a widow without the institutional backing of a husband or brother or father, which in his experience meant she would eventually accept less because her alternatives were limited. He did not know about Nate Yarrow yet. When he did, his approach shifted in ways that were illuminating about his character. It started when Flood came by the farm in his sleigh one January morning with the specific air of a man who had prepared a speech. He found Nate in the yard repairing a fence section and stopped his sleigh and looked at the situation for a moment, reassessing. Lena had come out of the farmhouse while they were still looking at each other across the yard. She had read the situation instantly. "Mr. Flood," she said, with the particular evenness she used when she was managing something carefully. "Come inside. I will make coffee." In the kitchen, with Nate present because Flood had made it clear by looking at him that he was factoring him into his calculations, Flood had laid out his revised offer for the wool contract. It was higher than his previous offer. It was still below fair market value, but the revision was significant enough to reveal that his previous position had been negotiating rather than factual. "I appreciate the revised offer," Lena said. "I also received a letter last week from a wool merchant in Denver who has offered me a price that is considerably higher." This was true. Nate had suggested she write to Denver, had known a name from his time moving through the territory, and she had written and received a response that was, as he had suggested it might be, substantially better than what Flood was offering. Flood looked at her, and then at Nate, and then back at her. "You found yourself some leverage," he said. It was not a compliment, but it was a recognition. "I found myself information," she said. "I was always going to take the best offer for my wool. I would prefer to do business locally, and if you can match the Denver price, I will." There was a moment of calculation behind Flood's eyes. He was not a bad man. He was a man who operated within the common assumptions of his time about what a woman without visible male backing would accept, and those assumptions had just been invalidated. He was adjusting. "I can match it," he said, after a pause that was one beat longer than comfortable but shorter than offensive. "Good," Lena said. "Then we have a deal." After Flood left, Nate had looked at her across the kitchen with an expression that was admiration and amusement in equal measure. "You enjoyed that," he said. "I have been waiting 4 months to do that," she said. "You could have had the Denver contact from the start," he said. "I should have suggested it earlier." "You were not here from the start," she said, "though I am not complaining about the timing." He looked at her with that warm thing in his face that she had catalogued and memorized without meaning to. "You are a formidable person, Lena Ortega." "I have had to be," she said. though it is considerably more enjoyable with someone to tell about it afterward. He came around the table to her side. She tipped her face up to look at him. He touched her cheek with one hand, the rough, warm weight of it, and she leaned into it slightly because she was past the point of pretending she did not want to. "I keep thinking," he said quietly, "that I should tell you something." "Tell me," she said. "I have not been entirely sure of my own motives for most of my life," he said. "When Rose died, something in my sense of myself got lost with her, not just grief, but the capacity to believe I knew what I was doing with any certainty. I have spent 6 years not being sure, and since I have been here with you that has changed." He paused. "I am sure about this, about you. I want you to know that." She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "I know. I have been watching you be sure about it for 2 months. I have been watching it happen." She turned her face into his palm. "I am sure too. I have been trying not to be, for very reasonable reasons, and I cannot manage it any more." He kissed her there in the kitchen in the January morning light. A long, unhurried kiss, the kind that did not need to be anything else or go anywhere. Just the full, honest expression of two people who had arrived at the same understanding from different directions. Clara, coming down the stairs, made a sound that was distinctly satisfied and then retreated back up them, and Lena pulled back from Nate and pressed her lips together against a smile and said, "We have an audience." "We probably always have an audience," he said. "Clara is better at surveillance than most people I have met," she said, from upstairs, Clara's voice. "I am not eavesdropping, I am just walking very slowly." Nate looked at the ceiling with an expression of helpless appreciation. "She is remarkable," he said. "I take no credit," Lena said. "She came that way." February brought a thaw that was brief and misleading, and then another hard freeze. And then March came in with the first suggestions of spring. The mud and the particular smell of wet earth that had been frozen and was releasing. And the farm began to show what it would be in the growing season. Nate had ideas about the farm. He did not push them. He raised them with the careful tentativeness of a man who was acutely aware that this was her place, her design, her life's work, and was not interested in overriding it. But the ideas were good, and she knew they were good, and she adopted them with the same practicality she brought to everything. He had grown up knowing horses. He suggested that a small horse breeding operation, even just 2 or 3 animals, could be a significant secondary income given the demand in the territory. He had contacts, people he had met in his years of moving, who could help her establish initial stock at reasonable cost. He had watched her manage the bookkeeping and the farm operations and the negotiations with Flood with the attention of a man thinking long-term, and his suggestion came from that thinking. Lena listened to all of it. Then she said, "You would have to stay to make that work." "Yes," he said. He said it without hesitation. She looked at him for a moment. "Then ask me properly," she said. He understood immediately what she meant. He had known this was coming, had been building toward it in himself, had needed to be sure she wanted it and not just the practical sense of it. He was sure. He had been sure since January, since the kitchen, since the moment he had said what he said, and she had leaned her face into his hand. He asked her on a Sunday afternoon in March, on the porch, with the first crocuses showing through the remaining snow and Tobias playing in the yard with his wooden horse and Clara reading on the porch, steps with the focused self-containment of a child, determined to be adult about a thing, while also being absolutely alert to every development. He did not have a ring. He had looked endurance and found that Hennessy's dry goods carried a modest selection, and he had a small amount of money from the wages Lena had insisted on paying him after Christmas. Wages he had argued against and lost the argument. He had bought a ring that was simple and good, a narrow band of silver with a small inset stone that was not a diamond, but was a clear, pale blue that caught the light in a way that seemed right for her. He asked her with his hands in his and his eyes on hers, and the words coming out steady and real. "Lena, I love you. I have been in motion my entire adult life, and I have never known what I was moving toward, and now I know. I am asking you to let me stay. Not as a hired hand, and not as a kindness, and not as a practical arrangement. As a partner, a husband, a father to your children if they will have me, a person who will work this land with you and build this life with you. I am asking because I cannot imagine anything I want more." He slid the ring onto her finger. She looked at it. She looked at him. Her eyes were bright and he was holding his breath. "Yes," she said. Tobias looked up from the yard. "What happened?" "Nate asked your mother to marry him," Clara said, without looking up from her book, with the precision of a reporter delivering facts. Tobias thought about this for a moment. Then he looked at Nate with the careful seriousness that was his specific mode of operating in the world. "Are you going to stay now?" he asked. "Yes," Nate said. "I am going to stay." Tobias nodded. He picked up his wooden horse and looked at it for a moment. Then he came across the yard and up the porch steps and stood beside Nate and said, "I am glad." Nate put a hand on the boy's shoulder, and Tobias did not move away. And Lena sat beside them on the porch with the ring on her finger, and the spring coming in, and her heart so full it was difficult to remain still under the weight of it. They were married in May, in the small church in Durance that Lena attended when the weather permitted, which was not as often as she would have liked. The minister was a kind, practical man named Reverend Aldrich, who had married and buried and counseled half the county, and had the permanent, slightly amused expression of someone who had seen everything human beings were capable of, and found them mostly wonderful despite it. Hank Colby and his wife Ada came. Ada cried, which she did at every wedding she attended, and which she had told Lena was her sacred right and prerogative. The Durance school teacher, a young woman named Miss Penway, who Clara admired with the focused reverence she brought to anyone she thought was doing things right, came and brought flowers from the mission garden. A few of Lena's neighbors, who had watched her manage the farm alone for 14 months, came with the quiet satisfaction of people who like to see a story end well. Clara was the witness on Lena's side, which she had requested with great solemnity, and which Lena had granted because Clara had earned it in ways that went far beyond witnessing a marriage ceremony. Tobias had asked Nate 3 days before the wedding, with the directness of a 6-year-old who sees no reason for circumlocution, whether he was going to be called Papa now. Nate had looked at him and had been quiet for a moment, and then he had said, "That is your decision. I would be honored if you chose to. I will be your father in every way that matters regardless of what you call me, but the word is yours to give or not give, and both are right." Tobias had thought about this with his characteristic seriousness. Then he had said, "I will try it and see." He had tried it at the wedding, when Nate was standing at the front of the church, and Tobias was supposed to be sitting with Ada Colby, but had materialized at Nate's side instead, which no one corrected because it was clearly where he needed to be. He had tugged Nate's coat and said quietly, "Papa," and Nate had looked down at him, and something crossed his face that was not something you could name in words, and he had taken Tobias's hand and held it through the ceremony. After the ceremony, in the small gathering outside the church in the May sunshine, Lena had stood with Nate's arm around her, and felt the weight of the ring on her finger and the warmth of the day, and the particular deep contentment of a person who has arrived somewhere they did not know they were heading, and has found it exactly right. "Are you happy?" she asked him quietly while the others were talking. He looked at her with those gray-green eyes that she had been reading for 6 months and would spend the rest of her life reading. "I am," he said, "in a way I did not know was still possible for me. Are you?" "More than I have words for," she said. "And I have considerable words." "You do," he agreed, and he was smiling, really smiling, the full, wide thing she had been drawing out of him for months, and she thought it was the most beautiful thing she had seen in a long time. That summer was the best summer she could remember. The farm expanded into the horse breeding plan Nate had suggested, slowly, carefully, with the contacts he had, and the capital she carefully managed. They acquired 2 mares in June, good-tempered animals with solid lines, and began the work of establishing what would eventually become the best reputation for trained horses in that part of Colorado. Nate had a gift with horses that was beyond mere competence, a quality of attention and patience that the animals responded to with a trust that was evident to anyone watching. Clara had opinions about every horse. She named them without being asked, and the names stuck because they were accurate. She had opinions about how they should be trained and about which of them had the best temperament, and about the theoretical framework for good horsemanship that she had apparently developed through extensive reading. And she and Nate had long, earnest conversations about horses on the porch in the evenings that Lena listened to from the kitchen window with a warmth in her chest that she did not bother to analyze. Tobias was learning to ride. This had been his idea, presented to Nate at breakfast one morning with the careful gravity of someone who has thought about something for a long time and is now committing to it. Nate had given him the same full, level attention he gave everything, and had begun teaching him with a patience and methodical care that Lena found almost difficult to watch without emotion. She watched anyway. There were adjustments. There were the ordinary difficulties of 2 people who had been living independently coming into the intimacy of shared life, the friction of differing habits and expectations that every marriage generates. Nate was neat in ways she was not, having spent years keeping order in the minimal space of a traveler's existence. Lena was territorial about the kitchen in ways she had not known about herself until someone else was regularly in it with her. They had arguments that were real arguments, not performative ones, the kind that happen between 2 strong-willed people who both believe they are right about something. The first serious one was about money. Nate had received a letter in July from a man in Denver who was offering good wages for a 2-month horse training job, the kind of short-term work that would have been easy for him in his former life, and that now required a different calculus. He brought it to Lena because he was someone who brought things to her, who did not make unilateral decisions about shared life, and she had felt, reading the letter, something cold and sharp in her chest that she could not immediately name. Later, alone, she had named it. It was fear. The specific fear of a person who has been left before by the absolute finality of death, and who now, having allowed herself to love again, is acutely sensitive to any version of leaving, even temporary, even logical, even explicitly returning. She had not handled the conversation perfectly. She had been too contained, too careful, which was its own kind of wall, and he had seen the wall and had stopped and said, "Tell me what you are actually feeling." She had told him. She had said it directly, the fear, the shape of it, the history that gave it its power. She had said it without making it his obligation to fix. He had listened to all of it. And then he had said, "I am not going anywhere. Not for 2 months, not for 2 weeks. The letter was information, not a plan. I brought it to you because you should know what opportunities exist. But this is my home and you are my wife, and there is no job in Denver that matters more than being here. I should have been clearer about that when I showed you the letter." She had let out a breath. "I should have asked before I started building a wall," she said. "We are both learning how to do this," he said. "We can be patient with each other about that." She looked at him. "You are remarkably reasonable for someone I was just unfair to." "You were not unfair," he said. "You were afraid. Those are different things." She loved him then, with a specificity and depth that startled her. She had loved him before, had known she loved him since winter, but this was different. This was the love that comes from being known in your difficult parts and being held there. And it was more permanent than the first kind, less like a tide and more like the ground. She kissed him, and they were standing in the kitchen where they had stood so many times before, and the summer evening came through the window, and the horses were settled in the barn, and the children were somewhere outside in the last of the light, and everything was exactly where it was supposed to be. In September, Lena discovered she was pregnant. She had suspected for 3 weeks and confirmed it with the quiet certainty of a woman who knew her own body. She told Nate on a Sunday morning before the children were awake, sitting on the porch with 2 cups of coffee and the early fall light coming across the mountains. She watched his face as she told him. The thing that happened to his face was something she had not seen before, something entirely new in her catalog of his expressions, a kind of opening, vulnerable and complete, like something that had been held very carefully for a very long time finally being set down. He reached over and took her hand and held it and could not speak for a moment. "Nate," she said gently. "I am sorry," he said, and his voice was rough. "I did not expect to." He stopped. "I thought I had lost the chance for this. For a long time I thought Rose and I would, and then that was gone and I thought—" He stopped again. His hand tightened on hers. "I did not expect another chance at this. I did not know how much I still wanted it until just now." She moved closer to him on the bench. He put his arm around her and she leaned into him, and they sat in the autumn morning with the news between them like a gift neither of them had asked for and both of them needed. "Are you frightened?" he asked. "A little," she said honestly. "I remember what it was like with Tobias and Clara. But I am not alone this time, and that changes the fear considerably." "You are not alone," he said. "You will not be alone, I promise you that." She believed him. That was the part that was new. Not the promise, but the belief, the capacity to receive a promise without putting a wall around her heart to manage the risk. She believed him fully and without reservation, and the believing was its own kind of joy. Clara's reaction was everything Lena had expected, and some things she had not. She was thrilled in a way she tried to present as analytical, but which came through clearly as the excitement of a 10-year-old who had very strong opinions about babies and had been wanting one for some time. She immediately had opinions about names, which she shared at length over several evenings, covering both male and female options with the thoroughness of someone who had thought about this. Tobias's reaction was quieter. He sat with it for a day and then came to find Nate in the barn and stood in the entrance for a moment. "Will you still have time for riding lessons?" he said. Nate looked at him. The question under the question was clear to him. He walked over to Tobias and crouched down to his level and said, "Nothing changes for you. You are my son. Whatever else happens, you are my son." Tobias's face did something complicated and then settled. "Okay," he said. "Okay," Nate said. He stood up. "Let us go work with Juniper." Juniper was the gentler of the 2 mares, the one Tobias had been learning on. "You are ready for the trot." Tobias's face lit up entirely. "Really? Really?" Nate said. The winter of 1883 was gentler than the previous one, which felt like something earned. They were better prepared in every way. More wood, more supplies. The farmhouse more properly sealed against the cold by a summer of work. The barn better insulated. The animals healthier. Lena moved through the cold months with a physical awareness of the pregnancy that was familiar and precious. the fatigue and the specific hunger, and the way the world had a slightly altered quality, heightened and fragile and vivid. Nate was attentive in ways that she had to occasionally manage, because she was a woman who valued her independence and did not want to be treated as incapable. They had one conversation about this that was productive and slightly funny in retrospect, in which she explained that she was pregnant, not ill, and he explained that he was not treating her as ill, but was simply, as he put it, interested in making sure she did not have to carry the heaviest things alone when he was available to carry them. She had considered this and agreed that it was a reasonable distinction. He brought her coffee in the morning before she got up. He read to her in the evenings, which was something she had not known she wanted until he did it, his voice quiet and even making the world smaller and warmer. He woke in the night when she was uncomfortable and did not make a production of it, just was present, his hand warm on her back. She told him one night in January, lying awake with the cold outside and the fire inside and the baby moving with the restless nocturnal activity that babies develop in the last months. "You are better at this than I thought any person could be." "At what?" he said. "At being in a life," she said. "At being present in it. You are someone who moved continuously for 6 years, and now you are here and you are so completely here. I do not take that for granted." He was quiet for a moment. "I spent 6 years being the absence of a person in a life," he said. "And now I know what it is to be the presence. The difference is not subtle." "No," she said, "it is not." She turned toward him in the dark. He pulled her in, careful and warm. The baby moved between them, a small, insistent communication from the future. "I need to tell you something," she said. "Tell me." "I was afraid last year before I let you stay, not of you specifically, of what it would mean to need someone again. I had been so careful about not needing anyone, and you came and you were," she paused, searching for the right word. "You were the thing I had needed and refused to know I needed. And I kept looking for the hidden motive or the secret that would explain why someone would be this good. Because in my experience, people were not just good without it costing something eventually. I kept waiting for it to cost something." "Has it?" he asked. "No," she said. "It has given me things." She put her hand over his. "I am sorry I looked for the trap. You were protecting yourself," he said. "You had reason to. I never minded the looking." "I know you did not," she said. "That was also confusing for me, because a person with a hidden motive would have minded." He made a sound that was almost a laugh. "That is a very Lena way of reasoning through a thing." "It is entirely logical," she said with dignity. "It is entirely logical," he agreed, with the particular warmth in his voice that she had come to recognize as his version of the wide smile, contained and deep. "Go to sleep." "I am not tired," she said. "You were awake at 3 this morning and 5 this morning," he said. "I have an active child," she said. "Our active child," he said. The possessive was gentle and solid. She felt it like something physical. "Our active child," she said, and let herself be held. Their son was born on a Tuesday morning in April, as the snow was finally retreating for good, and the first real warmth was coming through, a fact that Lena would always associate with beginning. Labor was hard and long, attended by Ada Colby, who had midwifery experience and doctor. Howell, who came out from Durance without drama, and conducted the whole business with his characteristic focused efficiency. Nate was present. He had asked if she wanted him there, and she had said yes without hesitation, because she wanted him everywhere that was important, and this was the most important. He held her hand through the worst of it. He did not talk too much or reassure too forcefully, which were both things she would have found irritating. He was just present, his hand holding hers, his eyes on her with an attention and a steadiness that she could use as something to orient by. The baby came in the morning light, a boy, loud and astonished by the world in the way of newborns. Nate held him before Lena did, just for a moment, while Ada finished the immediate care of Lena, and she watched from the bed with everything she had to give in her expression. He was looking at the baby with that same open, devastated wonder she had seen on his face in September when she told him. And she thought that she could look at that expression on his face for the rest of her life and never be bored by it. "He is perfect," Nate said, in a voice that was barely above a whisper. "He is," Ada Colby confirmed, with the authority of a woman who had seen many babies and was confident in her assessment. He brought the baby to Lena. She took him and looked at the small, furious, wonderful face and felt the specific quality of loving a new person that always startled her. Its immediacy and enormity, the way it arrived complete and without preamble. Clara and Tobias had been at the Colby farm during the labor. Hank brought them back that afternoon, and they came into the bedroom with the restrained excitement of children who have been instructed to be calm and are doing their best. Clara looked at the baby for a long time with a concentration that was almost scientific. "He has Mama's nose," she said finally. "He has Nate's ears," Tobias said, and then immediately looked at Nate to see if this was acceptable to say. And Nate nodded with an expression of solemn agreement, and Tobias's face relaxed into something that was entirely his real face, the one that came out more and more as the months went on, the one that was not cautious but was simply a happy 6-year-old. "What is his name?" Clara asked. Lena looked at Nate. They had discussed names and arrived at one and were waiting to say it when it was real. "Daniel," Lena said. "Daniel Miguel Yarrow." The middle name was for Miguel, which she had told Nate she wanted. And Nate had understood immediately and entirely, because he was someone who understood that a life is built on everything that came before it, that honoring what was does not diminish what is. He had agreed without hesitation. Clara said Daniel quietly to herself, testing it. Then she nodded. "It is a good name," she said, with the authority of someone whose approval had been neither sought nor was going unremarked. Tobias held the baby with enormous care and considerable concentration, and the wooden horse was in his pocket where it always was, and he looked at the baby's face for a long moment, and then looked up at Nate and said, "He looks like he is wondering what is happening." "He is," Nate said. "He has a lot to figure out." "We will help him," Tobias said, with a matter-of-fact certainty that was absolute and beautiful. "We will," Nate said. The summer Daniel was born was the kind of summer that becomes a fixed point in memory. Everything sharp and clear, and saturated with its own significance. Clara turned 11 and was more magnificent than ever, and began talking with increasing seriousness about schooling beyond what Durance could offer. A conversation that Lena and Nate took seriously and began making plans around, because Clara's capacity was real and deserved real response. Tobias turned 7 and became an increasingly capable rider, small and focused on Juniper's back with a posture that made Nate watch him sometimes with an expression that was pride so undisguised. It was almost embarrassing for a man who generally kept things close. He did not keep this close. He told Tobias that he was a natural, and he told Lena in private that he thought the boy had a genuine gift. And Lena watched her son grow into himself and felt Miguel in the careful deliberateness of him, and felt Nate in the confidence that was emerging, and thought that a child could carry more than one inheritance and be the richer for it. The horse breeding operation had grown. By the end of the summer of 1884, they had 4 mares and a breeding arrangement with a stallion owned by a rancher 2 valleys over, a man named Garrett Pierce, who had recognized good horse sense in Nate, and proposed the arrangement with a directness that Nate appreciated. The animals born of the arrangement were, without exception, excellent. Word spread the way word spreads in a territory, through the network of people who depend on each other for real things, and they had more requests for trained horses than they could fulfill. Lena managed the business side of this with the precision and toughness she brought to everything, and the conversations with Terence Flood were now conducted on entirely equal terms. The injustice of her early years with Flood, the systematic undervaluing of her work because of her gender and her widowed status, had been corrected not by complaint but by information, leverage, and the refusal to accept terms that were not fair. She knew other women in the territory who were in the same position she had been, without leverage and without information, and she began making a quiet practice of sharing what she knew with them. Names of contacts in Denver and elsewhere, the mathematics of fair pricing, the knowledge that alternatives existed. Nate supported this without reservation. He thought it was right, and he said so plainly, which she had come to expect from him and which still, even after 2 years, had the quality of a gift. In November of 1884, on a cold morning that was very like the morning 2 years ago when Lena had come out to find the stall door open and Callie gone, she walked out to the barn to find Nate already there. Callie's head over the stall door, and he was talking to her in the low, quiet voice he used for horses, which was a specific voice, different from any other register of his, the most unguarded he was in language. Lena stood in the barn doorway and listened for a moment without announcing herself, something she occasionally did, because the honest sound of someone you love talking to an animal is one of the best things there is. He was telling Callie about the year. He did this sometimes, she had discovered, used the horse as a kind of audience for the internal accounting he did not otherwise narrate aloud. He was telling her about Daniel taking his first steps and Tobias's riding and Clara's letter from the school in Denver that had said she was eligible for a scholarship program, and what that might mean. He was telling her about the farm and the horses and the contracts, and the fact that he had been thinking about building a larger barn in the spring. Then he said quietly, "I did not think I would have this. I want you to know that. I know you are a horse and you do not know what I am talking about. But I need to say it out loud to something. I have everything I want. I have a home, and I have Lena, and I have the children, and I have this land, and I have you, old girl. I did not think any of that was still possible, and it is, and I am." He stopped. "I am grateful. That is all. Just grateful." Callie shifted her head and pushed her nose into his shoulder in the way she had. Lena stood in the barn doorway with her heart so full it was uncomfortable, and did not wipe her eyes because the cold was a perfectly legitimate explanation for any moisture, and she was entitled to her dignity. She came in. He heard her footsteps and turned and saw her face and understood immediately. "How long have you been standing there?" he said. "Long enough," she said. He looked at her with the open, undefended expression that was his real face, the one she had been working her way toward for 2 years, and which was now available to her on an ordinary Tuesday morning in November. She crossed the barn and kissed him, and he held her with both arms, and Callie watched them with the equine patience of someone who has seen this before and approves. "I heard everything you said," she told him. "I know," he said. "I feel the same," she said. "About all of it. I want you to know that I feel the same." He held her tighter for a moment, then he said against her hair, "What are you doing out here at this hour?" "I was going to ask you about breakfast," she said, "but I think it can wait." "It can wait," he agreed. They stood in the barn in the November morning while the horses moved with their quiet weight around them, and the farm was alive with all the things they had built and tended and earned. And inside the house, their children were waking to a day that would be ordinary in all the best ways, and everything was whole. 2 more years passed, and the farm became a place with a reputation. Not a large or famous reputation, but the specific good kind, the kind that means something in a territory where winters are hard and trust is the currency that actually matters. People came from 3 counties for horses. Lena's wool went to Denver now at fair prices, and she had begun selling what she produced in excess of their own needs through the arrangement she had built with 2 other farm women who had followed her example with Flood and found their own Denver contacts. Clara left for Denver in the fall of 1886 to attend the secondary school that had accepted her. And the morning she left was one of those mornings that contains both grief and pride in equal measure, inseparable, the way the best things sometimes are. Lena held her daughter at the door of Hank Colby's wagon, which was taking her to the stage, and was quiet for a long time. Clara said, "I will write every week." "You will write twice a week," Lena said. Clara said, "I will write every week." Nate said, "She will write every week, which is excellent, and also the mail from Denver takes 4 days, and we will receive every letter, and you can write back as often as you like." This was addressed to Lena with the specific calmness he used when her emotions were very large, and she needed someone to stand in the practical facts with her. Lena looked at him. He offered his arm. She took it. Clara climbed into the wagon with her trunk and her books and her opinions, and she turned at the last moment and looked back at the farmhouse, and her family arranged in front of it. Nate and Lena and Tobias, who was 9 now and was trying not to cry, and Daniel on Nate's hip, who was not yet 2 and did not fully understand what was happening but could feel the weight of it. Clara said, "This is a good home. I want you all to know that I know that." Then Hank clicked at the horses and the wagon moved down the road, and Clara did not look back again because she was that kind of person, the kind who goes forward with full commitment once she has decided to go. Tobias did cry. He went inside and cried in the kitchen with a 10-year-old boy's complex combination of grief and shame about the grief. And Nate found him there and sat on the kitchen floor with him, which was, Lena thought when she came in and found them, the most significant thing she had ever witnessed. Nate Yarrow, who had once been in motion across an entire territory, sitting on her kitchen floor with her son because the floor was where they needed to be. Tobias leaned against him and they sat there a while, and then Tobias said, "She is going to be all right." "She is going to be extraordinary," Nate said. "She already is," Tobias said, with the precision of a boy who does not say things he does not mean. Clara wrote every week. The letters were long and detailed and opinionated, and full of observations about Denver that made Lena laugh and Nate read carefully, and Tobias quote at school, until his classmates grew tired of Clara Yarrow's observations about Denver. A state of affairs that Tobias found baffling because the observations were genuinely interesting. The year Daniel turned 3, Lena discovered she was pregnant again. She told Nate the same way she had told him the first time, on the porch in the morning with coffee. But this time it was a spring morning rather than an autumn one, and this time his reaction was immediate and joyful without the complexity of the first time. The first time had carried grief alongside the joy. This time it was just the joy, wide and clean. Daniel, informed by Tobias that a baby was coming, thought about it and then announced that he wanted a brother. Tobias, who had opinions about most things now that he was old enough to form opinions properly, said that it was not up to Daniel. Daniel considered this and then said that he would be fine with a sister as long as she did not touch his things. "She will touch your things," Tobias said. "He might not be a she," Nate pointed out. Daniel considered this. "He should not touch my things either," he decided. Lena's second pregnancy was different from her first and third in ways she could not entirely articulate to anyone who had not experienced it. She was older, 34, and the fatigue was more substantial and arrived earlier. But she was also steadier in herself and in the life around her, and the steadiness was its own form of energy. She moved through the months without the fear that had threaded through the first time, the fear of something going wrong, the fear of facing it alone. She was not alone. She had not been alone since the winter that Nate Yarrow had walked into her life and changed its shape entirely. The baby came on a December morning, snow outside and warmth inside, and she was a girl. Lena held her and felt the particular quality of a girl in her arms, familiar and specific. Daniel was informed that he had a sister and said nothing for a long time and then said quietly to Nate, "She is small." "She will get bigger," Nate said. "I know that," Daniel said, with the dignity of a 3-year-old, and went to look at his sister with the intense concentration of someone taking inventory. They named her Rose Lena Yarrow. Lena had suggested Rose. She had thought about it for months, whether it was right, whether it was a thing that Nate could hold without pain, or whether the name would carry too much of the old grief into their present life. She had asked him directly, one evening in October, lying in the warm dark of their room. He had been quiet for a long time, then he said, "Rose was a good person, a kind person. She deserved to be remembered with something good." He paused. "And this is a good thing. I think she would have thought it was right." "You do not have to if it is too hard," Lena said. "It is not too hard," he said. "It is the right kind of hard, the kind that honors something without being diminished by it." She had looked at him in the dark with everything she felt. "You are a very wise person," she said. "I learned it from you," he said, which was not entirely accurate but was entirely true in the way the best things are. Rose Lena Yarrow was, from her first week, a person of definite opinions and considerable volume. Daniel decided she was acceptable. Tobias, now 12, was her devoted champion from the beginning, carrying her and talking to her and telling her about horses in a way that suggested he expected her to understand and be interested, which she appeared to be. Clara came home for Christmas that year and held her new sister for an entire afternoon without putting her down, talking to her in the detailed, informative way she talked to everyone, filling her in on Denver and school, and the books she had been reading and the things she had been thinking. And Rose watched her with the wide, serious attention of a very new baby who is already paying close attention to the world. Lena sat in the chair by the fire that Christmas afternoon and looked around her kitchen, which was full of the people she loved, and thought about the morning 2 years ago when Nate had stood in this space and talked to his horse in the dark because he needed to say something out loud. She thought about the kitchen floor and the getting up. She thought about a frozen road in November and 3 rattlesnakes and a stranger who stopped to move them from her path. She thought about the morning he had stood in the snow with his back to her, and she had come out to find the stall door hanging open and Callie gone, and the understanding that had moved through her in that moment, the understanding of what he had given up and what it had cost, and why he had done it. That this was a man who did not measure what he gave against what he got, that this was the rarest kind of person. She was looking at him now across the kitchen, her husband, who was sitting on the floor with Daniel in his lap, while Tobias demonstrated something with one of Callie's offspring, a young bay gelding that Tobias had been working with for weeks. Nate was watching Tobias with the expression she had cataloged hundreds of times now, and would never stop cataloging, the one that was pure love presented as attention, as full witness to a person, as the willingness to see and go on seeing. He must have felt her eyes because he looked up and met her gaze across the room. And the thing that moved between them was nothing that could be named in a single word. It was every morning and every argument and every good day and every hard one. It was the ring on her finger, and the names of their children, and the farm that was more alive than it had ever been. It was the horse who had carried him to her on a frozen road, and the 3 rattlesnakes that had made him stop. He smiled at her. The full, wide thing, no containment, she smiled back. Clara looked between them with the expression of someone confirming something she has known for a long time. She looked back down at the baby in her arms. "Rose," she said quietly in her detailed, informative way, "when you are older, I am going to tell you how this all started. It is a very good story." Outside, the Colorado winter was doing its particular business, cold and absolute and indifferent. Inside, the fire was the right temperature, and the coffee was hot, and the horses were settled in the barn that Nate had built larger in the spring, and every person in the room was exactly where they were supposed to be. Nate stood up with Daniel still on his back, the boy having climbed there with the ease of long practice, and crossed the room to where Lena sat. He held out his hand and she took it, and he pulled her up and into him and held her with one arm, Daniel laughing on his back, and she put her face into the warm, solid reality of his shoulder and breathed. "Merry Christmas," he said against her hair. "Merry Christmas," she said. Tobias said something to the bay gelding that made the horse flick his ear forward in interest. Clara told Rose about the theory of horses. Daniel, from his position on Nate's back, announced that he was hungry. Rose made a sound of firm agreement. And the farmhouse held all of them, warm and whole and entirely itself, through the winter and all the winters after it, through the growing and the going and the returning, through every hard season and every good one, through all the ordinary, extraordinary days of a life that had been built on one moment in a blizzard, on one man's refusal to calculate what he gave, on one woman's courage to stop sitting on the kitchen floor and stand up. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything,